The railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. The crowd had gathered early. It was Tuesday, the 5th of July, 1910. The second day in a trial that had gripped the city of Newcastle. A colliery clerk had been murdered on the train to Allenmouth. Hundreds of pounds had gone missing, and a local man had been arrested. A huge crowd lingered around the court that summer morning. A lucky few had seats in the public gallery, but the rest would have to wait for newspaper reports of the drama that was to unfold. For this was the day the defendant would speak. This was the day John Alexander Dickman would tell his side of the story.
This was only the 6th murder in a railway carriage in the past half century, and it created very much a local sensation.
This was the first case of any similar murder in the north of England on a railway train. So it was actually a kind of very shocking thing to have occurred.
The physical evidence that the prosecution could present was actually very limited. The other evidence is very largely circumstantial, and that was the great weakness of the prosecution case.
John Nisbet was 44 years old. Married with 2 children, he led a happy, comfortable life. He was clerk and bookkeeper at the Stobswood Colliery company, where he'd worked for many years.
He lived just on the outskirts of Newcastle, and he was a wages clerk. A lot of mines in Northumberland at the time, and his job involved making up the wages and paying the wages.
John Nisbet was an ordinary man. He was trusted, he was liked, he was respected by his employers, he was approachable and cheerful.
Nisbet lived at 180 Heaton Road with his wife Cicely and their 2 teenage daughters. On the morning of Friday the 18th of March 1910, he left home and headed for the office of the Stobswood Colliery Company on Quayside, the commercial heart of Newcastle. And there he was handed a cheque, £370, 9 shillings and 6pence, the wages for the pit at Widrington.
Nisbet did this every 2 weeks. He would go to Newcastle and cash a cheque for the workmen's wages. He would then take this money back to the colliery and pay this money out.
It would be the payroll for the whole of that colliery, probably. By today's standards, you'd think very poor security to just go on your own in a train with that amount of money with you.
It was normal for such large amounts to be carried in this apparently informal way. People didn't really think about the risks.
Nisbet cashed the cheque at the Lloyds Bank and headed for Newcastle Central Station. Nisbet caught the 10:27 a.m. service to Allenmouth. It was due at Widrington Station just over an hour later. The colliery was a short walk from there. But Nisbet never arrived.
At the end of the line, the porter did his usual routine. He went through the train, opened the compartment doors to check if anything was there.
The guard saw that the window in one particular carriage was down, went to close it when he saw a stream of blood and a pair of smashed glasses.
Nisbet's body was found stuffed in a fetal position underneath one of the carriage seats.
He'd been shot in the head 5 times, which suggests that the murderer wanted to make sure that Nisbet was thoroughly dead. There was no question of him surviving the shots.
The murderer must have been just fired directly into Nisbet's face as he was sitting opposite him or standing opposite him. And then when Nisbet went down, the other 3 shots must have been fired, 2 behind the left ear and 1 behind the right ear.
There was no sign of Nisbet's attacker and no sign of his locked leather money bag. But the police investigation was to move quickly. The 10:27 service had not been a busy one. A number of other passengers had seen John Nisbet at Newcastle Station and on the train, and they said he was with someone. One of those witnesses gave police a name. Three days after the murder, Detective Inspector Andrew Tate knocked on the door of number 1 Lily Avenue. John Alexander Dickman had a lot in common with the dead man. Like Nisbet, Dickman was in his mid-40s and had been a Newcastle man his whole life. He too was happily married with 2 children. He'd even worked for a coal mine in the past as well. But whereas Nisbet was steadily employed, the man accused of killing him had a more varied career.
John Dickman is an interesting character. He was middle class, middling middle class, but Dickman did not follow the tenets of respectability. He did not behave as most middle class people would do.
John Dickman used to be the secretary of one of the mining companies. So he was involved in the mining industry in Northumberland. But what had happened was the company which he was involved with had been taken over by another company.
He'd negotiated the sale of a colliery through a coal merchant called Frank Christie. And for this work in the sale, Dickman had received somewhere between £400 and £500 commission.
And he decides, instead of simply getting another job and settling down with the ambition of becoming a head clerk, to become a speculator.
He was involved with betting and horse racing, got to the stage where his income was reliant on him backing winners.
He's a character who is very clearly living in the shadows. He is sometimes successful, but it seems that particularly by 1910, he was having something of a run of bad luck.
Dickman was asked to accompany Detective Tate to the station on Pilgrim Street. He donned his coat and boots. His wife Annie was still expecting him home for dinner later that night, but Dickman did not return. At the police station, he was arrested and charged with the murder of John Nisbet. And 3.5 months later, he was in the dock at the Northumberland Assizes. A guilty verdict would mean execution. On the afternoon of Tuesday, the 5th of July, Dickman entered the witness box. He would face 2 hours of questioning, 2 hours that would determine whether he lived or died. In the summer of 1910, a murder trial dominated the newspapers in the northeast of England. A colliery clerk, John Nisbet, had been brutally murdered on a train. And another Newcastle man, John Alexander Dickman, was accused of the crime. Dickman's fate would be decided in a stuffy courtroom at Newcastle's Moot Hall. By the afternoon of Tuesday, the 5th of July, the prosecution had presented their evidence. With each witness, they'd pieced together the last movements of the 44-year-old victim, John Nisbet. Several men had spotted him at Newcastle Central Station. He was seen on the concourse, he was seen on platform 5, he was seen climbing on board the 10:27 train. Next to him, the whole time, was John Dickman.
The prosecution's version of events was that Dickman had boarded the 10:27 train from Newcastle and got into the same compartment as Nisbet.
There was a chain of different witnesses that would give partial evidence, and put together, it looked fairly clear that they had got into the same compartment.
One witness, Charles Raven, agreed that while he had seen Dickman and Nisbet in close proximity, he couldn't be assured that they'd actually walked together onto the platform. But the crucial piece of evidence is the evidence of a local artist called Wilson Heppel. He had known Dickman for 20 years. This man, who was a keen observer, placed Dickman in the same carriage as Nisbet.
Cicely Nisbet testified next. It was her habit to meet her husband's train at Heaton station, the first stop on the line, and they would share a few words through the train window there, and perhaps Nisbet would even hand her his wages from the bag. Nisbet normally sat in a compartment at the rear of the train, but that morning was different. He was at the front, close to the engine, and he was not alone. Cicely could see that there was another man sitting with her husband. He had his collar turned up, she said, and his hat on. But she was certain the man was John Dickman. 2 clerks from another coal firm were also on the 10:27. Percival Hall and John Spink got off at Stannington, and from the platform they saw Nisbet still on the train. They knew the man and exchanged a brief greeting with him through the passing window. So Nisbet was alive when the train left Stannington. The next stop was Morpeth, just 6 minutes down the line. But at Morpeth, Nisbet's compartment appeared empty.
There was a plate layer working on the railway who went past the compartment but didn't see anybody in that compartment at all.
That was the reason he didn't get in. He didn't want to travel alone. He was clearly looking for company and so chose another carriage.
It was only when the train reached Allenmouth, the final stop, that Nisbet's bloodied body was found. He'd been shot 5 times through the head and bundled beneath the seat. His gold-rimmed spectacles lay crushed on the floor beside him. Whoever murdered John Nisbet had struck in those few minutes between Stannington and Morpeth. And Morpeth was the station where John Dickman got off the train.
There were other dimensions to the prosecution case. What they had, apart from Nisbet's murdered body, was some evidence on Dickman's clothing that there had been an attempt to remove stains.
On his overcoat there was a large stain which had been cleaned by his wife and which the prosecution alleged was blood staining from the killing of Nisbet.
Today, it may well have been found in the material, but in those days, in 1910, tests for human sort of blood were, well, they had been established, but they were in their infancy.
The prosecution then moved on to motive. By the time of the murder, Dickman's bank account at the National Provincial was empty, as was another at Lloyd's. His wife banked with the Co-op and the post office, but there was not £5 between them. The Dickmans may have lived in a comfortable middle-class district, but their bank accounts told a different story.
We know that he has very little in his own bank account. He's overdrawn. We know that his wife has a limited amount of money, but what we don't know, what there's no information about, is the shadier side of his dealings.
Dickman's financial situation at the time of the murder was very dire. In October 1909, he'd gone to a money lender and borrowed £20 on a 3-month loan at the interest rate of 60% per annum. At the end of the 3-month period, he hadn't been able to repay the loan, and so he took out another 3-month loan for the same amount, but he still could not repay the loan.
But the prosecution case had its flaws. The gun used in the attack was never identified or traced, so it was impossible to connect a weapon with Dickman. And the money hadn't been found either. Nisbet's bag had been recovered, found dumped at the bottom of a pit ventilation shaft, but it had been cut open. Just a few coins were left of the £370 it had contained.
You can't prove that he was the one who put the cash bag down the Isabella shaft, having slit it open and taken the money out.
The prosecution case was very much dependent on circumstantial evidence.
There was lots of evidence on motive into Dickman's debts and his money, the fact that he needed money, and so on. But as the trial judge said, well, motive is not evidence that he actually committed the offence.
The defence barrister, Edward Mitchell Innes, homed in on those gaps in the evidence. He picked at the uncertainties and contradictions of the prosecution witnesses. He quizzed Mrs. Nisbet's identification of the man with her husband. Wasn't the man sitting at the back of the compartment in shadow? And didn't this mystery passenger have his face turned away? Could she really be so certain it was Dickman? And what about Hall, one of the clerks who'd seen the dead man at Stannington? He identified Dickman from a line of 9 men at the police station, but was he quite as sure as he implied to the court?
Hall cannot swear to Dickman's being the person he saw in the carriage with Nisbet. He says he is like him, but he does not want to swear.
Although Raven, Hall and Wilson Heppel had all seen Nisbet and Dickman on the platform prior to getting on the train, they couldn't confirm that they had actually been together.
The interesting thing is that the defence cannot do anything other than argue that there is not an accumulation of evidence that is sufficient to amount to a credible prosecution case. They dare not throw doubt upon the credibility of the prosecution witnesses, because once they do, they open Dickman up to being cross-examined. They do not want Dickman's dodgy dealings, his speculation, his gambling, all the unrespectable things that he's up to come out in any detail. So they have to rely on trying to say the whole thing is just so circumstantial, you can't possibly make a credible case.
The prosecution had had their say. Now it was the turn of the defence. Mitchell Innes called just one witness. It was time for John Alexander Dickman to tell his story. At last, John Alexander Dickman entered the witness box. It was the afternoon of the second day in the trial, the moment the crowds inside and outside the court had been waiting for. This was a chance to impress his innocence on the jurors, to show he was an honest man who could never commit the terrible crime for which he stood accused. But any slip would be fatal. John Dickman's appearance in court would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Defendants had long been barred from giving evidence. They had to rely on their barrister to speak for them. They were simply not allowed to tell their side of the story on oath and in their own words. That changed in 1898.
With the passing of the Criminal Evidence Act, for the first time a defendant could give evidence on his own behalf.
It had been possible to put in unsworn statements for a few years before that, but it was relatively new and the practice was changing.
The defendant had had a voice, could respond to questions from the jury, from judges, but now it does set up a presumption that the prisoner would speak in his or her own defence.
It was thought at the time that a jury would want to hear from the person accused on what their account of their story was.
Not everyone was happy about the changes to the law. Some thought that allowing defendants to speak meant that they would be expected to explain themselves, that the burden of proof would pass from the prosecution to the defence.
Sometimes it wouldn't be in the interest of the defendant to give evidence on his own behalf because his nervousness in the dock would create a bad impression with the jurors.
The idea that the defendant would not give evidence in his or her own favour in a trial was actually intended to defend them, so that in their nervousness they would not convict themselves, they would not perjure themselves, that they wouldn't give the jury the wrong impression.
With his wife Annie watching from the gallery, Dickman told his story. Unsurprisingly, he painted a different picture to the prosecution. He never denied being on the 1027. He'd volunteered that information to police. But he was not with Nisbet, he insisted, either on the train or at the station. He'd seen the man, yes, in the booking hall. He knew him a little, enough to say good morning, but they didn't speak beyond that. And they did not share a compartment on the train. The witnesses were mistaken.
What you have is a man who, by a mixture of chutzpah, charisma, and self-confidence, a huge degree of self-confidence, believed that he could put a credible story forward that would convince people.
Dickman, he said, yes, I knew him. I bought my ticket the same time as he did. I was on that train, but after I bought my ticket, I went through the ticket barrier. I went off to the toilet. I was in a different part of the train and I didn't see him. So he admitted that he was on the same train, but denied any involvement in the murder.
Dickman told the court that he'd taken the train to visit the Dovecot Colliery near Stannington. He knew a man there and had business to discuss with him.
He wanted to go out and talk to William Hogg, with whom he was having some conversation about sinking a new pit.
Hogg later denied this in court, said that no such meeting had ever been arranged.
He said no, he wasn't due to see me. He didn't come to see me on that day at all. But he had been exactly a fortnight beforehand. So Dickman had actually gone on that train exactly a fortnight before, when the wages were also in transit, as if it was some kind of dress rehearsal.
Dickman did not claim that he had an appointment. He just indicated that he thought he would go out.
He got on near the back of the 10:27 train. Settling himself in the compartment, Dickman opened his newspaper and was so engrossed in reading it that he missed his stop. He got off at Morpeth, paid the excess fare, and set out on foot for the colliery.
On the way to Dovecot Colliery, Dickman became ill. He complained, feeling very unwell, and lay down in a field for about half an hour.
He's overcome with illness, diarrhea, and lies down for about half an hour, he says, on his overcoat before making his way back to the station, where he meets a man whom he knows called Elliot, very clearly the dodgier side of his dealings, before taking a train home.
Piece by piece, Dickman rebutted the rest of the prosecution evidence. The incriminating gloves, they were too small. He hadn't worn them since Christmas. The blood on his trousers, that was probably from a nosebleed. And he had never struggled to pay his bills. He was not as hard up as his bank statement suggested. He simply preferred to keep cash in hand. Watching reporters described Dickman as alert, confident, and cool. But the greatest danger was yet to come. After Dickman's statement, the prosecution barrister Tyndall Atkinson stood to cross-examine him. He questioned the accused man on his relationship with the victim, and he pushed Dickman on his knowledge of collieries, of how wages were paid. After all, Dickman had once been a clerk in the exact same role as Nisbet. Dickman was forced to admit he did know more than he'd let on. He was beginning to look evasive.
He had a ready answer for pretty well everything, but they were clearly answers that did not carry conviction.
The more he was cross-examined, the more his accounts of having taken the journey for some particular reason to do with his business, which wasn't very clear and wasn't corroborated, didn't come over very well.
His claim to have been so absorbed in the newspaper that he went past his station, his claims to have no knowledge of the Isabella pit, they simply do not seem to have rung true with the jury.
His account of what he had apparently done between leaving the train at Morpeth and then returning home was very vague, and nobody could be traced to verify what he had said at all.
His account of the day of the murder was not very plausible. Dickman said that he had moved to the back of the train and it was there in that carriage that he'd travelled. Now, when he was asked, he couldn't identify any witnesses in that carriage. He couldn't give any names. He couldn't say where they'd actually got out of the carriage. He said his defence was that he was confused by all the questions that he was being asked.
After more than 2 hours in the witness box, Dickman stood down. The case for the defence was complete. Early in the afternoon of the third day, the jury retired to consider their verdict. Outside, rain fell. The crowds, which had gathered, were chased off by the unseasonably damp and cool weather. But the courtroom at the Moot Hall was no less crowded. After almost 3 hours of deliberation, the jurors filed back into the room. They had made their decision. Dickman was guilty. He was sentenced to death. But all hope for the convicted man was not lost just yet. Dickman still insisted on his innocence, and thanks to the recently established Court of Criminal Appeal, he would have another chance to escape the noose. In July 1910, John Alexander Dickman was found guilty of the murder of John Nisbet. Nisbet had been robbed on a train from Newcastle to Allenmouth. Shot 5 times in the head. His body was discovered under the seat of an empty compartment. Dickman was arrested 3 days later and convicted at a trial at Newcastle's Moot Hall. But there were hopes he might avoid execution. An appeal was immediately submitted by his defence team. This was still a novelty in England. The Court of Criminal Appeal had only been established 3 years earlier in 1907. For the first time, it had given convicted prisoners like John Alexander Dickman the right to appeal.
Before the Court of Criminal Appeal, right of appeal could be made directly to the Home Secretary. It was in his power to grant a pardon or reduce a sentence.
And the Home Secretary and the Home Office staff were in a position where they had to make a decision when they weren't particularly legally trained, and it was very unsatisfactory. So it was far better that experienced judges should consider the appeals and consider that sort of issue rather than it being left to Home Office, civil servants and the Home Secretary as a politician.
Among Dickman's supporters, there was still hope. On average, more than 70 appeals a year were successful, with convictions quashed or sentences reduced. And Dickman's could be among them. His appeal was heard in London on the 22nd of July 1910. 3 judges, including the Lord Chief Justice himself, would decide whether the conviction would stand.
Dickman's appeal was based on the error made by prosecuting counsel. The controversial issue was the failure of Mrs. Dickman to go into the witness box and give evidence on her husband's behalf.
A wife could give evidence at a trial, but she couldn't be compelled to do so. But when the prosecuting counsel was summing up to the jury, he actually mentioned that the jury hadn't had the benefit of hearing from Mrs. Dickman as a witness.
The prosecution could not do this. They could not comment on the fact that she had not gone voluntarily into the box. That was absolutely forbidden by the law.
When the jury had retired, the defence counsel said that the prosecuting barrister shouldn't have mentioned this. So when the jury came back ready to give a verdict, the trial judge asked them whether it had borne any significance in their discussion.
The foreman of the jury at that point says, well, actually, we didn't think about it, we haven't included it, we've already come to our verdict.
These procedural irregularities can happen quite often in criminal trials. It's up to the appeal court to decide how significant it had been.
The Court of Appeal makes it very plain that Coleridge's behaviour had been entirely fair. He had remedied a very minor mistake, which, as the jury itself had confirmed, had not had an impact on their deliberations and their actual verdict.
The judge said that this had already been dealt with in the court by the presiding judge and could be dismissed.
The defence, conducted by Mitchell Innes and William Percy, decide to try to get the bench to consider it not just on a point of law, which was the point which Winston Churchill had actually referred it to the court, but also to open it up as a matter of fact.
Since Dickman's trial, new evidence had emerged that cast doubt on the guilty verdict. Percival Hall and John Spink were two crucial witnesses. They'd given evidence that the murder victim was alive when the train reached Stannington. And they had identified the man with Nisbet as John Dickman. But there was more to that identification than was revealed at the trial. When Hall and Spink arrived at the police station to view the lineup, they were asked to wait in a passageway. There, a policeman invited them to look into another room where John Dickman was being held. The two were then allowed to discuss whether or not he was the man they'd seen on the train, all before the identity parade had even begun. Police, it seems, were so certain they had their man that they fixed the identification. When Percival Hall was still unsure, they strong-armed him into making a decision.
The evidence of Percival Hall, this was all challenged, again, as not showing that Dickman was actually talking to Nisbet and in company with him.
The police had behaved badly, but it was plain that the testimony given by Hall was not crucial to the success of the prosecution case with the jury.
As in all appeals, when they're first set out, it seems quite convincing, but the judge did really say that identification was actually satisfactorily established, so the appeal court dismissed that part of the appeal for that reason.
All the defence can do is to try to bring evidence that Heppel is an incompetent witness, which, because of the importance of his testimony, might have changed things.
Heppel, he said, was old and decrepit and couldn't be trusted.
But Heppel's eyesight was keen. His eye for detail underpinned his paintings. You could ignore the other witnesses. You cannot dispute and get over Wilson Heppel's testimony.
The appeal was rejected. A last-ditch plea to the Home Secretary followed, but that too was turned down. In government, there was much criticism of police conduct in the investigation, but Dickman's execution was given the go-ahead. On Monday, the 8th of August, Annie Dickman and her 2 children visited the condemned man at Newcastle jail. The family was permitted one last half hour together. At the end of the allotted time, Dickman asked to kiss his wife and children goodbye. They wouldn't let him. The family could only wave as the guards took him away. The next morning at 8 o'clock, John Alexander Dickman was hanged.
There were certain cases, and Dickman's was one of them, where it would have been better had the accused not give evidence on his own behalf.
Dickman's story does not go down well with the jury. His narrative, his explanations, they find unconvincing, not because of the inherent unbelievable nature of what he said happened, but I think because of his personality, something which does attest to the concerns of some of those arguing that the Criminal Evidence Act 1898 would not, in fact, particularly help defendants.
John Alexander Dickman had the chance to tell his story in court. He was calm, he was confident, he was not believed. A crowd had gathered that day outside the courthouse, and a crowd gathered outside the jail 1 month later. Dickman's story came to an end on the 9th of August 1910 with a short walk to the scaffold and a noose around his neck. He had nothing more to say. It was not the first time he'd been sentenced to death. The 23-year-old former soldier said nothing as he was taken away. A condemned cell was waiting for him. Would he pay the ultimate penalty this time? Or would he escape the noose once again?
It was a time when the death penalty was being reviewed and was quite contentious, but in this case, people would have said, well, if he had faced punishment for the original crime, then actually he wouldn't have been free to have murdered a few years later.
He was given a pardon and his freedom, which allowed him to kill a second time several years later.
This is a case where a nice, inoffensive man might not have died if an earlier death sentence had been confirmed.
James John Alcott was born in Woolwich on the 13th of October 1929. Soldiering was in his blood. His mother, Nellie, was the daughter of a Scots Guardsman. His uncle had been in the Coldstream Guards, and his father, Joseph, had served as a private in the Second World War. All his life, Alcott had wanted to follow in their footsteps. But young Jimmy was not an obedient child.
His mother described him as having a bit of trouble and in high spirits and that sort of thing when he was young.
His father seems to have been somebody who was absent a great deal of the time.
He was brought up very much by his mother, who lived in Bexley Heath in South London with 3 other children.
Young Jimmy seems to have got up to a fair amount of mischief, to have been a not untypical young tearaway. But as he moves into his early teenage years, he does descend into a greater criminality. Somebody who is considered likely to become a career criminal unless action is taken.
When he was 10 years old, he was caught stealing a bicycle. He was stealing money by the time he was 11, and his behavior became so bad that he was sent to an approved school for young people beyond parental control. He was at the institution in Farnborough for 3 years.
Approved schools in those days were designed to try and turn juvenile offenders into more disciplined young adults.
It was a charity organisation. It was designed to help vulnerable young people and their families when they were in times of trouble.
For Jimmy Alcott to end up in one of them was a real positive attempt to make him into a useful member of the community.
But Alcott never gave up on his dream of becoming a soldier. When he left school, he joined the local cadets. In 1947, he turned 18. He'd grown into a tall and handsome young man. He volunteered for the Grenadier Guards. He was posted to Germany.
The Grenadier Guards were on occupation duties in Germany. It wasn't particularly exciting, it wasn't particularly challenging.
At the time, just after World War II, there was an awful lot of British soldiers stationed in Germany. It was the occupying army gradually returning the administration to normal civilian administration of the German state.
They're on guard duty, they're policing the black market, they're acting as an overseeing force as Germany tries to reconstruct itself.
Alcott, however, had not left his rebellious ways behind. In September 1948, he snuck away from his base in Germany and went wandering in the countryside. There, he met a Czech refugee. The pair decided to walk together to France.
Basically, Jimmy gets bored and decides to abscond. He's fed up with being a regular soldier. He's very clearly fed up with rules, regulations, and being told what to do.
Alcott said that he suffered at different times from blackouts, and it was allegedly during one of these blackout periods that he went AWOL, he went absent without leave.
They ended up in a small place called Munterbauer near Koblenz, and there was a lodging house or small hotel.
In its garage was a motor car. The two men tried to steal it, but there was a night watchman on duty. Peter Helm was his name, and when he went to stop the thieves, they attacked him.
They hit and assaulted this night porter, one with a fire extinguisher and one with a whiskey bottle.
We don't know what exactly instigated a brutal and fatal attack on the night watchman.
Two days later, Alcott was found and arrested. In January 1949, the young Grenadier Guardsman was hauled in front of a general court-martial.
A general court-martial is the highest level of court-martial, and it is the only one that has the power to pass a death sentence.
The normal court-martial dealt with all ranks in the army and general breaches of military law. A general court-martial dealt with commissioned officers and other ranks who had committed serious offences.
Effectively, it was a criminal trial, but within the military system, with military law that governed how the proceedings should take place.
Alcott insisted he was innocent. The night watchman had offered them coffee, he said, but had then thrown boiling water in their faces. Alcott and his Czech friend had fought back in self-defense. He was not believed. Alcott was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But as the 19-year-old waited in a cell in Germany, his story took an extraordinary turn. Alcott's parents, Nellie and Joseph, didn't know about their son's arrest or his conviction. They'd received no official notification, and it was only when an army chaplain wrote to Mrs. Alcott that the truth came out. The newspapers soon took up the story. A Labour MP pressed the War Minister in Parliament. How could the parents not have been told their son had been tried for murder and condemned to death?
Jimmy's family are shown in the newspapers as a family that is shocked by the sentence passed on their son. So it's a human interest story. There is a subtext in there that A, he'd killed a foreigner, and B, that the attack had also involved another foreigner. So there's something of a hint reading between the lines of perhaps it was the foreigners who really did the fighting.
Death sentences handed down by court-martial had to be officially confirmed by the King. But for Jimmy Alcott, the confirmation was delayed and delayed. Then, early in April 1949, a dispatch rider pulled up outside the home of Nellie Alcott. He was carrying a letter from the War Office. At first, Mrs. Alcott was too frightened to open it. When she finally worked up the courage to read the letter, she burst into tears. Her son's death sentence had been quashed. Jimmy was coming home. James John Alcott was given a second chance. His death sentence was commuted by the King. He returned to England, where he was discharged from the army.
The royal prerogative of mercy does not overturn the conviction. That still stands. So when Alcott was freed, he still had the conviction of murder against him.
It's a way of sweeping the whole thing under the carpet. There is a very clear hope that he has learned his lesson, and on return to England, to his family, he will settle down and be an improved character.
Still just 19 years old, he began to build a new life for himself. He got a job on the railways. It was a time of change in Britain. The post-war Labour government had embarked on a massive programme of nationalisation and reform. There was a brand new system of social security. The National Health Service had been founded, and strict controls were introduced on what could be built and where. The reforms touched almost every aspect of life in Britain, and the railways were no exception.
Originally, of course, they'd been set up by individual private companies with their own routes. Gradually, these had sort of amalgamated together. But during the war, they'd had to coordinate an awful lot more because of the war effort. And in 1947, they were nationalised as one national rail system under the British Transport Commission.
In 1947, the plans were introduced for the nationalisation of the railways. In 1948, nationalisation did take place, and there was this unification of all the companies into this one major unit.
By 1952, Jimmy Alcott was working as a railway fireman. He was based at the Hither Green Depot in southeast London. He'd married a French woman, and the couple lived in her grandmother's flat on Eltham Palace Road.
He was a sociable man. It's certainly something that was noted of him by his fellow workmates at Hither Green, that he'd always stop for a chat rather than getting on with his job.
He got a job on the railway as a fireman, stoking the boilers of steam engines, which were very common in those days.
He doesn't seem to have distinguished himself in any particular way. He's just average. He doesn't make waves, but he doesn't win the approval of his superiors.
Monday the 18th of August was the first day of his annual leave. Alcott and his wife were planning to go to France. He went to the depot to collect his £16 holiday pay. But before he headed home to join his wife, there was one more thing he needed to do. He travelled to Aldershot. There he spent 15 shillings on a sheath knife. Then he made his way to the nearby village of Ash Vale.
He never seemed to go back to his wife and take her to France as he'd promised, and perhaps that was part of his unreliable character, that he was wandering off.
It's very plain that he deserts again, whether it's intended to be long-term, whether it's aberration, we just don't know, because he never provides any credible explanation. I find myself speculating that he's trying to meet up with old friends.
It's an area he would have had a reasonable knowledge of because of his school days and because of his military career.
It was probably that memory that had drawn him down to that area, and he visited the railway station.
Ash Vale stood on the line from Alton to London Waterloo. It was not a busy station most of the time, but at weekends it thronged with soldiers on leave from the nearby army base. In hours, it could sell hundreds of pounds worth of tickets. That money was Jimmy Alcott's target. He planned his robbery carefully. At first, he just watched. Ash Vale station was spread over 3 stories. Passengers entered at street level, they bought their tickets on the first floor, then climbed the stairs to the platforms and waiting rooms at the top. From 6 in the morning to 8 o'clock at night, At least 2 porters and a booking clerk were on duty. Every evening at 7:45, the clerk in the booking office drew down the shutters. Tickets and date stamps were handed to the senior porter. After that time, passengers had to buy their tickets on the platform.
We have to assume that Alcott did not manage to meet anybody from his previous life, and he therefore drifted to the railway to meet up with railway staff.
It was about 30 miles south of London. The station itself was very small, just a station and 2 lines running parallel to the Basingstoke Canal.
It was not a huge station, but it was a busy station. There was a lot of traffic, a lot of people from the garrison, the nearby military camp, would choose to use Ash Vale because it was more convenient than going all the way into Aldershot or all the way into Farnborough.
On Thursday, the 21st of August, Alcott returned once again to Ash Vale station. At around 5 in the afternoon, he asked senior clerk Norman Thompson if he could use the telephone in the booking office. He showed his British Railways staff pass. He wanted to call his depot.
He worked the sidings at Hither Green, which was quite a large goods yard, and in shoveling the sort of clinker, which is the remains of ash from the boilers of these steam engines, he'd apparently shovelled some of this out and had injured one of his colleagues.
An unconsidered motive behind his actions this week is an expectation that he's going to be disciplined or even dismissed on his return from his holiday, and that he wants to find out what's happening.
Alcott was let in. He phoned his depot. They were going to check, he said. Could he wait there for a call back?
No such call ever comes in, and he drifts off again, but he keeps coming back to Ash Vale.
Alcott was hanging around the station. There's no other way to describe it. He was there all the time.
In retrospect, it does seem that he was actually examining the normal working practices of the railway staff on that railway station to see what the pattern was when the booking office would close and so on.
There was no attempt to conceal an identity, which is surprising in view of what he was planning.
By closing time, Alcott had become so chummy with Norman Thompson that the older man offered him a lift back to Aldershot on his motorbike. Alcott knew the staff, their duties, their schedules. He knew where the money was kept and how he could access it, and he had the knife. Everything was ready. The next day was Friday. It would be one of Ash Vale's busiest days of the week, the perfect day for a robbery. Jimmy Alcott had finished his reconnaissance. It was time to put his plan into action. On Friday, the 22nd of August, 1952, he returned once more to Ash Vale station. At 6:30 in the evening, he again asked to use the station telephone. He then got chatting with the booking clerk on duty in the tiny gas-lit office. The clerk's name was Geoffrey Charles Dean. Like Alcott, the 27-year-old was an ex-soldier. He'd served with the paratroop regiment in Norway during the war. By August 1952, he had a 5-year-old daughter, and his wife was expecting their second child.
He was in charge of selling the tickets, counting the money. He was the booking office clerk, so he was in charge of running that.
He'd had this job for about 15 months or so, so he'd probably joined the railway as a booking clerk after he'd been demobbed after the war.
He is someone who had served with respectability, if not huge distinction. During the war, he had been a dutiful member of the armed forces, and he was very proud of that service.
His role at the station was that of sort of a wages clerk, and to see to the tickets and to tot up the cash at the end of each working day.
He settles down to work for the railway, marries, and becomes a much liked, a much respected member of the local community. He gets involved with local things like football, and he's not in any way an intemperate man. He's a dutiful and dedicated employee, and he was liked. Everybody liked this unassuming, inoffensive man.
Alcott lingered in the booking office with Dean. Like everyone else, he was soon calling Geoffrey Dixie. The nickname was inevitable. Dixie Dean was not only a world-famous footballer, he'd also worked on the railways as a boy.
He was Dixie Dean because of his own interest in football. And of course, these were the days when Dixie Dean, the great footballer, was still very much remembered and with huge affection.
Renowned for playing at Everton, he actually had the record number of goals scored in a season. People had nicknames in those days sort of very frequently. If his name was Woods, he'd have been called Timber. If his name was White, he'd have probably been called Chalky White. So he was known by his nickname of Dixie Dean.
At 7:45, as usual, Dixie closed the office hatch. He handed the tickets over to the senior porter on duty. He told him he'd be staying a little late to work on his accounts. A change in the fares was coming and he wanted to be ready.
That was part of his job. He had to make sure all the money tallied up and with all the records, and that was a job that they would have to do, you know, by manuscript, because there weren't computers doing that sort of thing in those days.
The last thing the porter saw as he moved away from the office was Alcott sitting in the office talking to Dean.
Alcott was still there as Dean counted up the day's takings. Over £168, just shy of £5,000 in today's money. The pair chatted and joked. Dean was having trouble with his books. He was £10 over and couldn't work out why. But behind his smile, Alcott's thoughts were on his back pocket, where the knife was waiting in its sheath.
James Alcott had asked to use the telephone in the booking office to check up on this colleague that he had injured at Hither Green, and had actually, over that week, inveigled himself into the normal kind of activities of the staff, become known to the staff at Ash Vale, and they had trusted him as a fellow railwayman.
He doesn't seem to have raised any particular surprise or alarm or comment. He was a fellow railwayman, he was hanging around, nobody quite knew why, but he seemed affable and pleasant, and he's young and chatty, so why not?
At 8:45 that evening, Army Corporal Kenneth Vincent arrived at Ash Vale station. He climbed the steps to the first floor and went to the booking office to buy a ticket. The wooden shutter was down. But he could hear people inside, muffled voices, a scuffling sound. He rapped on the sill with the coin, but nobody came to the hatch. Then he saw the notice. After 8 p.m, passengers must buy tickets upstairs. The corporal left. He didn't know it, but just inches away on the other side of the hatch, Geoffrey Dean was fighting for his life. Alcott's attack had been sudden and vicious. He plunged his knife into the back of Dean's neck, but the booking clerk had fought back. He'd screamed for help, kicking and punching at Alcott. In the cramped space of the booking office, the two former soldiers had wrestled desperately over the knife.
It seems that he was very largely taken by surprise. One can only speculate that Alcott took him off guard, that he had absolutely no suspicion of Alcott having any sinister intent in spending time with him.
Dean was stabbed in the face, the chest, the abdomen.
He must have been stabbed continually long after he'd been unable to resist.
So it was very clearly a vicious, sustained and brutal attack.
Shortly before 9 o'clock, a 15-year-old porter spotted something strange. Young Cedric Bull had just helped a passenger take some luggage down from the platform to the street. And as he was heading back up the stairs, he tripped and fell. Getting up, he saw a light on in the booking office. Surely Dixie wasn't still working. He knocked. There was no answer. He tried the door. It was locked. Cedric went out of the station. He climbed the grass embankment towards the window of the booking office, and perching on the sill, he peered into the tiny room. He could see Dixie on the floor. The booking clerk was covered in blood, and he wasn't moving. The boy scrambled back down the slope and ran inside. He alerted the station master, Mr. Luck, who ordered the office to be forced open.
They saw Dean's body partly concealed by the desk. He was lying in a great pool of blood. The safe door was opening, and there was about £160 worth of cash had been taken from the safe.
Now this must have happened within a very short time of the murder having happened. It's sometime between 8 and 9 that the murder was perpetrated. The body was actually found just after 9.
Poor Geoffrey Dean had suffered some really serious injuries.
He had been stabbed 20 times. One behind the ear was particularly deep and fatal. Another stab wound got the jugular.
He had 7 stab wounds in the back, 9 in the chest, one of which went through the sternum, the chest bone, into the heart.
Basically, there was no question of Dean being able to survive this frenzied attack.
Police were quickly alerted, but there could be no doubt as to who had committed this terrible crime. The attacker must have been the young, handsome railwayman who'd been hanging around the station for days. But by then, James John Alcott was nowhere to be seen. Police arrived at Ash Vale station within an hour of the murder. The booking office was photographed. Then the body of clerk Geoffrey Dean was removed to Farnham mortuary. The police investigation moved rapidly. They commandeered a waiting room by the platform and began interviewing passengers and staff at Ash Vale.
The overall investigation was in the hands of the Surrey Constabulary. They were assisted by their local Hampshire Constabulary, and they in turn were assisted by the British Transport Police.
The railway police undertook all the railway connected inquiries, and the Surrey police took over the other inquiries round Aldershot and so on. The inquiries soon led to the suspicion about James Alcott, and he was an unusual character, if not downright suspicious. He'd been hanging around, so it was natural the police should want to trace him.
A description of the chief suspect was circulated to cafes and shops in the area, and a check was made of all local hotels and lodging houses. Police quickly scored a lead. There was a bed and breakfast in Aldershot at number 10 Victoria Road. A young man had checked in there late the previous night. The owner, Mrs. Edith Dagger, confirmed to a police constable that her new guest matched the description of the wanted man. In the front bedroom on the first floor, the constable found a blood-stained navy blue jacket. In the pocket were 2 10-shilling notes and a passport in the name of James John Alcott.
Alcott was not a particularly clever man. I don't even know whether he'd actually intended to kill Dean, and that quite literally he was bewildered. He did not know what to do.
James Alcott was a strange character, and probably had been a strange character ever since he was a boy.
It seems, looking at his youthful behaviour, that he had no idea of what the logical consequences of some of his actions would be.
He doesn't return home, he doesn't hide, he just makes it easy for the police to find him. And I think that is explicable only by saying that, quite literally, he himself did not know what to do and where to go.
After his savage attack on Geoffrey Dean, Alcott had moved quickly. A Mac had been hanging on the back of the door, and Alcott grabbed it, pulled it over his blood-stained clothes. Emptying the safe, he'd stuffed the money and his knife into his pockets and hurried away from the station. At a stream nearby, he'd washed the blood from his hands. Then he'd caught a number 44 bus from North Camp back to Aldershot and gone to the pub.
It is very difficult to work out exactly what was going on in his mind.
He didn't seem to make any attempt to go to France with his wife or to leave the area, and I think nobody quite understood his mentality.
He had his passport with him, and instead of making his way abroad or back to London, he stayed overnight in the area, and so a door-to-door inquiries the next morning quickly located his presence.
The next day, as police closed in, Alcott went shopping. He bought a new jacket, some grey flannel trousers and a pair of shoes. He wrapped his old trousers in paper and dumped them on waste ground near Ordnance Road in Aldershot. But when he returned to his lodgings at 11:15 that night, the police were waiting for him.
He virtually admitted that he had been involved in the murder. And first of all, he denied knowing where the knife was, but then said that the knife was hidden up the chimney.
He must have realised that, having spent 3 days at the Ash Vale station, there were people who knew him. They knew his name. They knew the station he worked at in London. They'd seen his British Rail pass.
When he was arrested, he made no secret of the fact that he had been responsible for the attack. So there was never any question of it being important to look for anybody else.
Alcott's trial at the Surrey Assizes began on the 18th of November 1952. No witnesses were called for the defence. Alcott's barrister tried to plead insanity. Why else would the killer make such a poor attempt to conceal his crime?
The only defence that was possible was that Alcott was not sane at the time, that he had suffered a fit of temporary insanity.
With the murder of Peter Helm, he said that he'd had these periodic blackouts, and at his trial he again referred to these periodic blackouts. He said that he'd suffered one at the time of the murder, and in fact he didn't even know why he was at Aldershot, but he'd also admitted the killing. He told the police on at the time of his arrest that he had done the killing, so it was a cast-iron case against him.
With the forensic science examination, the blood stains on the knife and on the wallet and on banknotes and on Alcott's clothes were all found to be blood group O, and that matched Geoffrey Dean's blood group. They also found some fibres on the knife, on the murder weapon, which matched a pullover that Geoffrey Dean had been wearing at the time.
Circumstantial evidence, forensic evidence, all makes it absolutely clear that Alcott was the one who wielded the knife and took the life of Geoffrey Dean. No question of it.
The jury, 10 men and 2 women, deliberated for 20 minutes. Then they returned with their verdict. Alcott was guilty. The judge, Mr. Justice Finnemore, sentenced the 23-year-old to death. Alcott had heard the words before, but this time there'd be no newspaper campaign, no questions in Parliament, and no reprieve. Alcott was executed at Wandsworth Prison on the 2nd of January 1953.
The local papers, though they acknowledge that he had previously been sentenced to death and been reprieved, there's no sign of any major popular outcry, which I have to admit I find surprising.
Perhaps out of loyalty to the armed forces and the Grenadier Guards, they just regarded it as something very separate from if it had been a murder that had been committed on British soil.
To have criticised the previous decision would, of course, have been to criticise the recently deceased king. So I think that helps to explain why more is not made of that particular aspect. And it's more a question of, well, he was lucky before, this time justice has caught up with him properly.
He knew what he was doing. He seemed to plan the murder because he bought the knife in advance. He seemed to be casing out the railway station in order to work out the best opportunity for committing the crime.
The real sympathy goes to Dean's wife and daughter, and that's where the real comment comes in. In many ways, Alcott is dismissed.
Alcott's victim, Geoffrey Dean, was laid to rest on the 29th of August 1952. The cemetery by St. Peter's Church in Ash was just a short distance from the railway. As 27-year-old Dean's coffin was lowered into the earth, amid the tears of family and friends, a passing train slowed to a mournful pace. The 24th of May, 1957. It was Friday night, almost 10:30. At London's Gloucester Road tube station, 32-year-old ticket collector Emmanuel Akinyemi was on duty in the lift. He had just taken 2 passengers down to the Piccadilly line and was about to return to the station above when there was a knock. Emmanuel opened the lift door. It was an elderly woman wearing a white coat and a red hat. She was tall and silver-haired, and she was gasping for help. "Bandit, bandit," the old woman cried. "I've been knifed."
This was bizarre, it was unusual. Her attacker had obviously got some professional skills.
At the time, there was no one on the platform. There were no witnesses to the deed.
It shows just how rare murder on the Underground actually is. The impact it had at the time was huge.
It was a great unsolved mystery of the London Underground.
Emmanuel Akinyemi helped the woman into the lift. There was blood seeping from a wound in her chest. He asked her what had happened, but she could barely speak. She just kept repeating the same word again and again. Bandits, bandits. An emergency staircase spiraled 87 steps from the platform to the street. It was the favourite exit of fare dodgers, so Akinyemi always kept an ear out. That night, as he journeyed up in the lift, Akinyemi heard a rush of feet on the spiral stair.
The rail employee had heard somebody running up the emergency stairs, which sometimes people did to avoid paying their fare. There was no automatic ticket barriers in those days.
Now, to get to the ground took 43 seconds. Anyone can beat the lift. So possibly this was her attacker running away.
When the lift reached the top, however, there was no one to be seen. Akinyemi fetched her some water and left her in the care of a colleague. Then he ran to a phone box and dialed 999.
It's a measure of just how different the times were, that there was no resource to call from within the station. He had to go to a nearby phone box to phone 999 and summon an ambulance.
The ambulance was quick to arrive. St Mary Abbott's Hospital on Marlowe's Road was just half a mile away. As she was loaded on board, the old lady was still clutching her Underground ticket.
She was stabbed 5 times, apparently 4 times in the stomach and once in the back, piercing the heart.
There were no defensive injuries, which suggests that she had had no time to ward off her attacker.
I suspect that her murderer came up behind her, stabbed her in the back, and when she didn't go down, she turned around, and that's when he continued his attack.
The woman's injuries, however, were too severe. Soon after arriving at the hospital, she died. Her last words had been to a police constable who had accompanied her in the ambulance. "I was on the platform, I was stabbed." But the words had choked in her mouth and she'd said no more. Nobody knew the woman's name or anything else about her. The only clue to her identity was found at the hospital. On her forearm was tattooed a number, 44747.
The number on her arm would have told the investigators that she had been a prisoner of the German concentration camps during the Second World War.
And it meant, of course, that her life had been very far from peaceful.
She had clearly been in a concentration camp in the past, and she was rapidly identified.
Number 44747 was, in fact, Teresa Lubienska. She was a 73-year-old Polish countess. She lived on Cornwall Gardens, just a short walk from Gloucester Road tube station. The Countess was well known in London's Polish community. She was widely admired, not only for her heroic exploits during the war, but also for her community work in the years since.
The Polish community was deeply saddened. She was a major figure.
So Countess was admired and had a good reputation amongst the Polish people in London because of her unstinting hard work on their behalf.
There was a tremendous outpouring of grief. She was loved, she was regarded as a treasure, she was highly respected, and people just could not understand the reason for this brutal attack and her death.
Nobody had seen the attack on the Countess. There was no sign of the murder weapon. And even exactly where Teresa had been assaulted was a mystery. Was it on the platform or on the train? The only blood evidence was by the lift, where Teresa had found ticket collector Emmanuel Akanyemi.
Those were long before the days of CCTV or any kind of recording devices on platforms, on trains and things like that.
No direct witnesses, no forensic evidence, no CCTV images. Even in modern times, this murder might have got unresolved.
The motive for the murder is very unclear. Was it a robbery that went wrong, or was the Countess Lubienska a victim of something that had happened in her past?
As police began to investigate, they quickly realized that Teresa Lubienska was a woman with a remarkable story. A woman whose death was as mysterious as her life had been extraordinary. Countess Teresa Lubienska was 73 years old when she died. Hers had been a life of privilege, tragedy, and great bravery. Teresa was born on the 18th of April, 1884. Her family was an old aristocratic one, and she married into another. She became the Countess Lubienska.
She lived on the family estate in some wealth and privilege.
The family she married into was one of the leading noble families in Poland. They had vast estates, they had distinguished individuals in their historic past. They had a very proud Polish heritage.
Her husband was a diplomat, and they had two children, a daughter Isabella and a son Stanisław.
But the violent upheavals of the 20th century would soon engulf Teresa's life. In 1918, the Bolsheviks seized the family estate. Teresa's husband was stabbed to death.
The Lubienski estates were in the eastern part of what was beforehand of the Polish Commonwealth, so in lands which were part of the Russian partition. And when the Bolshevik Revolution broke out, these territories were engulfed by the revolution.
Teresa was widowed with 2 children, her estates largely lost, but they were very far from penniless.
She moved to Warsaw and lived in a flat, obviously in far less wealthy conditions than she had been when she was first married.
The end of the First World War had redrawn the political map of Europe. Poland became a free, sovereign nation for the first time in more than 120 years.
It was a period of great activity for the whole nation, rebuilding its independent state.
There was huge rejoicing, and quite a lot of Polish families actually travelled back to help support and develop this new, old, independent country. And Teresa Lubienska was very much part of that.
She was a very talented person who could not sit at home twiddling her thumbs or just being happy doing the knitting. She herself was a very creative person. She published several poems. She was an interior designer, and she was the co-owner of a small film production company.
In time, her son joined the military. He became an officer in the Polish cavalry. He'd be on the front line when the independence of his nation was threatened once again. In September 1939, Poland was invaded by Nazi Germany, and within days, the Wehrmacht had Warsaw surrounded.
It was for a Polish army that was not well armed, fairly small, a desperate situation.
The Polish forces didn't really have any chance of mounting any significant resistance, although they fought very bravely.
In fact, Teresa Lubienska herself took part in the defense of Warsaw, being very active, especially in soup kitchens and providing food for the command of the defense of Warsaw.
Her son, Stanislaw, is in the premier cavalry regiment of the Polish army, the Uhlans, 14th Regiment. And it meant that apart from anything else, he was expecting to be at the forefront.
The 32-year-old Captain Lubienski was stationed in a village just north of the capital. He tried to break through the German lines and make contact with his command post. A machine gun cut him down. He was carried to a nearby farm, and there he wrote a few last words to his mother before he died. The Nazi invasion of Poland from the west was followed by a Soviet invasion from the east. Proudly independent Poland was carved up between them. The Germans occupied Warsaw, but Teresa remained defiant. She made sure her son's body was taken from its battlefield grave and given a proper burial. Then she joined the resistance.
Nazi Germany's policy towards the Poles was that it was intent on destroying both the native Polish state and the Polish nation.
But the Polish resistance was pretty successful in disrupting German communications and generally making themselves difficult.
The kernels of it began just before the capitulation of Warsaw, and it developed into what is popularly known as the Armia Krajowa, or the Home Army. Arguably, it became the largest resistance organisation in occupied Europe, as well as probably one of the most effective.
Stefan Witkowski was an eccentric and charismatic engineer. He founded the Musketeers, a network of resistance cells scattered across Poland. At the heart of the Warsaw cell was Teresa Lubienska. The 55-year-old widow lived on Saviour Square in the city centre. Her apartment there became known as Salvation.
This is a woman of guts, of passionate commitment to Poland and to the Polish people. You can't be as deeply involved as she was with all the various elements of the Polish resistance without putting yourself in enormous danger.
If she was arrested, then she faced torture, interrogation, imprisonment and probably death.
The work of the underground resistance in Poland was very, very dangerous. There was always the risk of betrayal by informers or collaborators.
The Gestapo were hunting down any opposition to Nazi rule. Spies and informants were everywhere. And there were divisions in the resistance itself. In 1942, Witkowski, leader of the Musketeers, was accused of collaboration with the Germans. He was tried and executed by his fellow Poles. The network he had led collapsed. Teresa was betrayed to the Nazis.
Teresa Lubienska was betrayed by the caretaker of the block in which she had her flat, and as a result, she was arrested by the Gestapo.
Her connections, her reputation, it would have been good for the German occupiers if they could possibly have used her on their side, but of course there was absolutely no hope of that.
She was taken to Pawiak prison for interrogation. It was an old jail in the heart of Warsaw. When the Nazis occupied Poland, it became a Gestapo prison. Over the course of the war, more than 100,000 prisoners were detained there. Almost half never came out. But not the Countess. After 6 months in Pawiak, she was transferred out of the prison. She was sent to Auschwitz. Teresa arrived at the death camp on the 13th of May, 1943. There, she was not Teresa. She was not the Countess. She was number 44747.
Prisoners entering the prison for the first time would see above their heads a sign saying, "Work makes you free." It was a place of death.
She did much to try and alleviate and help her fellow prisoners by talking to them, even giving some of her rations of food, especially to the children.
She used her reputation and her sheer determined character not only to keep herself alive, but also to help and give comfort to the other prisoners.
The war was not going well for Germany. As the Red Army advanced through Eastern Europe, the Nazis began to evacuate and liquidate the camp at Auschwitz. In August 1944, Teresa was transferred 400 miles west to Ravensbrück. There, at last, she would find her salvation. The Swedish Red Cross were negotiating the release of prisoners from the concentration camps. Talks with senior Nazis were led by Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte. On the 21st of April 1945, Heinrich Himmler agreed to free all women held at Ravensbrück. Teresa and thousands of others boarded white-painted buses. They were to be transported north through Denmark to Sweden.
It seems that Teresa was one of the last contingent to be evacuated from Ravensbrück, very possibly because she herself wanted others to go first. It would be very, very much within her character that that was the case.
In Lund, safe at last, Teresa wrote poems of thanks to her saviours. "Swedes," she wrote, "dearest to our hearts, God bless you for your hospitality." But she would not stay in Lund. Like thousands of other Poles after the war, she chose to make her new home elsewhere. She moved to London. After moving to London, the Countess lived in a single furnished room and survived on national assistance. But she did not let that poverty stop her.
It would have been very easy, I suspect, to have sunk into depression after a pretty unpleasant and challenging time in Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, but not Teresa. She takes a lead in the exiled Polish community.
The majority of the Polish soldiers remained in exile and found permanent homes in various countries of the world, but primarily in Great Britain, which was the centre of much of the political, cultural, economical, academic and educational activities of the Polish community.
They could not go back to Poland, which was now completely under Russian domination. It was Stalin's Russia, and the government in Poland was now a Russian puppet government.
Teresa was not interested in going back to Poland after the war because the Soviet takeover of Poland represented to her the death of the Polish culture, Polish nationalism, the Polish heritage that she treasured.
The 73-year-old became one of the best known and most respected Poles in all of London. Her life was committee meetings one day and association dinners the next.
She founded the Polish Association of Former Political Prisoners, and she spent her time organising, lobbying and trying to get compensation for her fellow Polish people.
She was particularly concerned about the lack of recognition of the fate of Polish concentration camp prisoners here in Britain. Various prisoners of different nationalities received compensation or were in the process of receiving compensation, but the Poles who were living outside of Poland received nothing. And it was her life's mission to rectify this.
This was a woman with a considerable amount of energy, tenacity and determination. She had guts. She didn't give up.
The 24th of May, 1957. It was the name day of Maria Tchaikovsky, and she was throwing a party. 30 friends joined her to celebrate. Among them was Countess Teresa Lubienska. The name day party was in Ealing in West London. After eating and drinking and toasting the health of all present, the Countess decided it was time to head home. She left the party at around 9:30. She was joined by her friend, 50-year-old priest Kazimierz Krzyżanowski. Together they walked to Ealing Common Tube Station. There they caught an eastbound Piccadilly line train.
Father Krzyżanowski was an assistant in the Polish parish in Brompton Oratory, but also a personal friend and a vice chairman of the association of which Teresa Lubienska was chairwoman.
Because it was after 10 at night, there were relatively few people on the train. There was nothing out of the ordinary, there was nothing particularly alarming.
At Earl's Court, Father Krzyżanowski got off. He wished his friend good night, and the doors closed, and the train carried the Countess off into the tunnel. The next stop was Gloucester Road. Father Krzyżanowski returned home. He could not know it as he went to bed that night, but police had already begun investigating his friend's murder. The investigation was led by F Division's Detective Superintendent Ronald Vivian. After 27 years on the force, he was nearing retirement. Vivian was looking forward to it. He never wanted to be a policeman in the first place. But if this was to be one of his final cases, it would not be an easy one.
It was such a difficult case because there was no evidence.
The post-mortem showed that the knife had been used, had a blade of no more than 2 inches in length. An unusually short weapon for such a murderous attack.
So the police knew that she had been stabbed. They knew that it had taken place on the platform. Her dying words were, "Yes, I was on the platform, I've been stabbed." It was the bandits.
She was, by all accounts, however, alone on the platform, and there were no witnesses when the station clerk, Emmanuel Akinyemi, went down and found her.
Nobody actually saw the Countess attacked on the station platform. In fact, nobody knew precisely where the attack had actually taken place on the platform. There were no bloodstains to mark the location. There were bloodstains by the lift along the Countess's clothing, but the exact location of the attack could not be pinpointed.
Police photographed the scene and dusted for fingerprints. They scoured the platform, the lifts, the emergency stairs. Then they turned to the mammoth task of searching the tunnels. 2 miles of track between South Kensington, Gloucester Road and Earl's Court stations had to be checked. Floodlights were brought in, and police used magnets and giant vacuum cleaners to search every inch. But they found nothing. Staff and passengers at Gloucester Road were interviewed. Police quizzed the drivers of trains and buses that were in the area. They searched drains and sifted through rubbish in the hunt for a clue, any clue. But again, they found nothing.
It was a joint investigation with the Metropolitan Police Murder Squad, who were in overall control. The bulk of the work seems to have fallen on the London Transport Police.
This was an unexplained death on the Underground, and they felt it necessary to conduct this huge, extensive search in order to reassure the travelling public, to make sure that people carried on using the tube.
The police really were desperately going through the methodical police work to try and find clues and leads.
But the police were, in the absence of any concrete information coming from Teresa herself or from her friends, left with virtually nothing to work on.
The police needed more information. A massive publicity campaign was launched, Scotland Yard's biggest ever. Posters were displayed across London. Appeals were broadcast on the television news. Over the summer of 1957, police received hundreds of leads. They interviewed thousands and journeyed across Britain and Europe in search of clues. But they made no progress.
It was a very big inquiry. But the police just didn't have enough to work on.
They had the dying words of the Countess. They had the evidence of the underground employee operating the lift who saw her. They had his evidence that somebody had run up the emergency stairs at about the same time. And then, despite all the searches and the interviews, they didn't find anybody else who had actually given them that crucial lead that murder inquiries so often need.
Between them, the British Transport Police and the Metropolitan Police conducted over 18,000 interviews, trying to track down somebody who might have seen something suspicious, somebody who could be persuaded to acknowledge some kind of involvement. And time after time after time, they drew a blank.
The murder of Teresa shocked London's Polish community. The murder made no sense to them. They couldn't believe this woman had any enemies. Who would have wanted to kill her? Detectives in the Kensington headquarters puzzled over the same question. Was the murder of Teresa Lubienska the work of a maniac, a robbery gone wrong, or was it an assassination? Police investigating the murder of Teresa Lubienska were running out of ideas. The 73-year-old Polish countess had been stabbed on a platform at Gloucester Road tube station. She had died of her injuries in hospital, but the mystery of who had attacked her and why remained.
They had a number of apparently puzzling, contradictory features. First thought, this was an attempted robbery, but she still had her handbag. More than that, she had been out for the evening. She was wearing a valuable brooch.
It was unlikely to be a robbery as nothing was stolen from the Countess. Her handbag was with her and it hadn't been either opened or rifled through.
There was no sign of any panicked attempt to grab, so the police dismiss robbery.
She seems to have been taken completely unaware by her attacker, who got close enough to stab her 3 times in the chest with a 2-inch bladed knife, 2 of the blows going into the heart and killing her. Murder seems to have been her attacker's intention. It wasn't robbery.
The tiny bedsit where Teresa had lived was searched. Scores of papers were carried away. The Countess could speak 4 languages, and there were letters and documents in English, German, French and Polish. She had contacts with former concentration camp inmates around the world. Might a clue be somewhere there? Could she have known a secret that someone would kill to protect?
There was grounds, certainly, for suspecting that this could have been an ordered political hit. Teresa is often put down as a social activist, and she was, but there was a very strong political dimension to that social activism.
She had apparently told friends that she had felt under threat in the previous week or 2 beforehand, and had in fact gone to the police station to report that she'd had some threatening phone calls and letters.
After all the experiences she had, she was going to be too shrewd not to recognise she was being followed.
But it seemed rather illogical that a political assassin would have left so much to chance on an underground station platform when anybody could have come along, or another train could have arrived, or a member of the station staff could have been there.
So far as the police were concerned, it seemed unprofessional. Why not a gun? Why not poison? And if a knife, why not a knife actually designed for the purpose of killing?
Police had ruled out a robbery, and they could find no political motive for her murder. It was not an assassination. Detectives kept returning to one theory, though. Teresa had been a formidable woman. Despite her advancing years, she thought nothing of confronting poor behaviour when she saw it, of giving a piece of her mind to young hooligans, or, as she always called them, bandits.
When she got off, apparently there was a group of teddy boys on the platform waiting for the train.
Some youths were being a bit disorderly and rowdy. Some suggestion that maybe the Countess sort of ticked them off, possibly, for misbehaving.
Teresa Lubienska was a very forthright person, so if someone would have been pushing onto the train without letting someone off, she wouldn't have remained silent, but would have said something.
Despite the Countess's use of the phrase bandit, I don't think this murder was actually committed by a gang of hooligans. The only person heard by the station employee was of a single person running up the emergency stairs. Only one person seems to have been involved in the attack.
This is 57. This is when we're building up to a panic over gang warfares. So it's a very obvious suggestion. But if it had been a gang of youths, we'd have heard about it by now. One thing about gangs is that somebody talks.
If there had been a gang on the platform that night, they were never identified or traced. The police investigation into the murder reached a dead end.
They come to the conclusion that it has to be simply a random, impulsive attack. I simply cannot find that credible. She was a target, but I think it was a more personal than a political attack on her.
My own feeling was that it was related to something that had happened back in wartime Poland during her work in the resistance. Possibly her attacker was a collaborator who had suddenly surfaced in London, recognising the Countess or knowing of the Countess, feared that she might betray him or her.
The knife used suggests that it was more likely to be opportunistic. Oh my goodness, here is the woman I'm following. There's nobody else on the platform. The train has gone. Let me take this opportunity to get rid of her, rather than being a planned attack.
There's a natural feeling that there must be some evidence somewhere amongst that background that should have led to the case being solved. We will never know for sure, and it's one of these murder mysteries that we'll always have to wonder about.
The grief of Teresa's friends and the wider Polish community, however, went on. The funeral of the Countess Lubienska took place on the 1st of June 1957. More than 1,000 mourners packed into the Brompton Oratory in Knightsbridge.
Brompton Oratory was the centre of the central London Polish parish. So it was a place where Poles always gathered on Sundays and on special days.
There were representatives not just from the Polish community in this country, but also members of the Polish resistance, representatives from the various groups, turn up to pay respect, pay their tributes to her. So it was something that was a great grief to the Polish community.
Leading the funeral procession was General Anders, wartime commander of Polish forces. After him came comrades from the resistance, those who had suffered with the Countess in Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, and those who'd known her kindness and determination in London. Lying on Teresa's elm coffin, 2 medals gleamed from a purple cushion, orders of merit from the Polish nation, tokens of their gratitude.
The Countess was an extraordinary woman. There was a tremendous amount of sympathy and love displayed at her funeral.
The Polish community were devastated by the fact that this 73-year-old woman should have experienced so much in her life and so much tragedy and violence and survived, and then been stabbed and murdered at a supposedly peaceful tube station in London.
It's a word that's often used lightly, but I think that Teresa Lubienska most truly qualifies as a heroine, because despite everything that happened to her, she carried on.
Teresa Lubienska, when she was in a concentration camp, was known as the White Angel, helping wherever and whoever she could. I think, looking back at her life, she comes across as being a feisty, determined angel of mercy, a remarkable person.
Teresa Lubienska was a devout and brave daughter of Poland. To this day, her murder remains unsolved. But her heroism in peace and in war has not been forgotten.